Today's presentation is a collaboration between UPLAN and the Center for Law and Social Policies, or CLASP. That will be recorded, and the slides and recording will be shared out after the presentation. And now I'm going to hand it over to class.
I would love to just take a chance to introduce myself and have my colleague Alejandra, we both work at CLASP, just do a quick introduction. So my name is Alicia Hardy. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Law and Social Policy on the Child Care and Early Education team.
And hi, everyone. My name is Alejandra Lindano Gomez. I am a policy analyst on the Child Care Early Education team, and I also work at the intersection of immigration. So happy to be with you all.
So let's just take a moment to go over today's agenda. The first step we'll do is that we will take a preview of a cheat sheet that we created to help guide today's presentation. After that, we are going to set the stage about why the federal budget process is important. Then we'll take some time to break down the annual federal budget and the 3 spending categories. After that, we really will get to the meat of the presentation. A lot of that stuff is setting the level. And then we're going to talk about the 5 key steps to the federal budget process. About halfway through those 5 steps, we will take a break where you will have a chance to stretch your legs and get some water, or you can choose to stick around and chat with me in the main room or in a breakout room with Alejandra for Spanish language interpretation, where you can ask some questions about what you learned so far, get some clarity, or you can feel free to take that whole time for a break because we will have a question and answer session at the end. Finally, after we've done the budget training process, we'll take some time to talk about how UPLAN works in action and has engaged in the federal budget process at the in their time. And so as we go through the presentation, feel free to use the chat, to ask questions, to share thoughts, or to talk about your own knowledge that you're bringing to the conversation about the federal budget process. I do want to make one last quick note that the slides that we've created today, as well as the cheat sheet, have a lot of text. There's a lot of text on the slide that you'll see, but this is so that you won't feel pressured to have to take notes and keep up with everything that we're saying, but instead this will be a resource that you can come back to over time and be able to continue to learn and grow your knowledge. And so with that, I'm going to get us started. So as I just mentioned, we did create a cheat sheet, and this is just a preview of that. And if you haven't already received a copy, you can expect to receive one along with the recording following the presentation. It has key terms that we will cover today, as well as a graphic from the Congressional Research Service that visualizes the federal budget process and the timeline. The presentation and the cheat sheet are both tools we hope you can use to continue building knowledge and learning about the federal budget process. Admittedly, this is a complicated process, and learning about the many rules and the pieces and the advocacy opportunities takes time. I know that I'm on a continuous journey to learn about this process, and I know, and I think I speak for Alejandra too, that we are both continuing to learn. But we see this training as an introductory overview of how the federal budget is created, who is involved, and the different opportunities for advocacy. So why is the federal budget process important? Well, the big answer is that it's because it happens every year. And each year there's a window of opportunity for advocacy. This process is the main way programs get funding, including those that UPLAN advocates for. And this could mean advocating for increased funding to meet growing need or to reduce funding connected to harmful programs. It creates space to engage and build relationships with members of Congress on the Hill related to the federal budget and other priorities to support long and short-term advocacy strategies. And because it happens each year, it's a key opportunity to uplift specific priorities and connect priorities to the need for more funding, and being clear that costs increase each year, and so should investments. The federal budget process officially begins with the president's budget request to Congress. Many of you may note that that was released today, and it ends with Congress when Congress passes the required bills to set spending levels and the president signs those bills. The federal budget determines how much funding is available for the federal government to spend each fiscal year, and each fiscal year is from October 1st to September 30th. The federal budget process is essentially how Congress appropriates or sets aside money to make payments for specific purposes. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's talk about the three parts of the federal budget. The federal budget is made up of three spending categories: discretionary, mandatory, and net interest. Discretionary funding levels are set each year by Congress through 12 appropriations bills. Those bills determine spending authority or set boundaries around how those funds can be spent. Mandatory funding does not usually change each year because it is set by a longer-term legislation or bills that determine funding levels and spending authority. And we'll talk about these in depth on the next slide. And the last category is net interest. And this is the extra money, the extra fees, essentially, the federal government must pay to keep borrowing and keep accessing loans to keep up with federal spending. These loans are connected to the federal deficit and the debt ceiling. The mandatory funding category is sometimes called direct spending because these funding levels are set by authorizing laws that directly control how much can be spent instead of Congress determining how much can be spent each year. The way these funding levels change, or the only way these funding levels change, is if Congress acts to change the authorizing law that controls that mandatory funding. The laws that authorize mandatory funding or mandatory spending require those funds to be provided each year and is not dependent on Congress. So these funding levels are usually more stable than discretionary funding. The laws that authorize mandatory spending can be permanent, meaning they do not change or end unless Congress passes new legislation, or those authorizing laws have amounts that's the same for a specific number of years, and then Congress must renew those laws, those authorizing laws. Some programs that fall under the mandatory category are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So looking at discretionary funding, Congress must decide discretionary funding each year for the upcoming fiscal year, or keep spending at the same level, which rarely happens. These funds, the discretionary funds, are split across 12 appropriations bills. Once those bills are passed, they give the federal government spending power based on the details of those bills. Each year, Congress must decide the appropriate funding amount across those 12 appropriations bills, making these funds more uncertain and more unstable since Congress has the power to change how much funding is set aside each year. Sometimes those 12 bills are combined into one large bill called an omnibus bill, or combined into several bills called minibus bills. Nearly half of all discretionary funding goes towards national defense. The remaining funds are called non-defense discretionary funds. Now it's time to dive deeper into the details about the federal budget process and how Congress passes these 12 required appropriations bills. To do this, we will be showing snippets of this amazing video from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. The videos break down the federal budget process, and after each of those snippets are shared, Alejandra and I will take time to walk through that step of the process. So let's get started with the first two videos. The first will be a high-level overview of the budget process overall, and the second will focus more on the president's budget request. The video snippets are quite short, so you don't have to worry about watching videos endlessly.
The federal budget process is the way the federal government decides how to spend money. There are 5 main steps. 1. The president sends a budget request to Congress. 2. Congress writes and votes on budget resolutions. 3. House and Senate appropriations subcommittees mark up bills. 4. The House and Senate vote on appropriations bills and turn them into one big bill. And 5, the president signs all of the different appropriations bills and the budget becomes law. One, the president's budget request is what the
So this video gave us a great overview of the 5 steps of the federal budget process. And now we are going to dive deeper into the president's budget.
1. The president's budget request is what the president wants the budget to be. A budget request shows what the president thinks is important to spend money on. The president starts by listening to budget requests from different departments in the government, like the Department of Education or the Department of Labor. Each department tells the president how much money they need. The president listens to all of the departments. Then the president decides how much money to ask Congress for in the budget request. The president's budget request needs to say how much money the president wants to spend, how much money the government wants to get from taxes, if the government is going to spend more or less money than it gets from taxes. After the president has listened to all the departments and answered these important questions in the budget request, they send the budget request to Congress for review.
Now, like we heard in the video, the president's budget lays out the administration's priorities for federal programs, for how much should be spent on defense, agriculture, education, or health and other areas. The proposal includes how much money the federal government should spend, how much tax revenue it should collect, and how much of a deficit or surplus the government has. The president is expected to reveal their budget request on the first Monday in February. But as Alicia mentioned, for the fiscal year that we're in right now, he just revealed his new presidential budget request. Now, the president's budget includes both mandatory and discretionary spending, as well as net interest spending. As we learned a little bit ago from Alicia, discretionary funding changes from year to year and is more uncertain, while mandatory funding is long-term and often very stable. Our presentation today will mostly focus on discretionary funding because it can change from year to year. As the video also explained, the president's budget is formulated over a period of months with the assistance of the Office of Management and Budget, or sometimes called OMB. The Office of Management and Budget helps bring the president's vision together and heavily supports the development and execution of the budget. This process often starts in the fall. To create the budget, each federal department and agency provides details and supporting documentation on its own funding requests for the president to consider. For example, the U.S. Department of Education can request funding for a particular program relating to parent engagement, or the Department of Health and Human Services can ask for more funding for the Child Care and Development Block Grant. The budget can change up until the day the president introduces his budget. There are several ways that people and organizations can influence the president's budget. These include establishing ongoing relationships with the Office of Management and Budget and other White House staff, connecting with the Office of Management and Budget starting in the fall to advocate for the highest possible amount of funding to be secured for the programs that you advocate for, and send letters to the administration to advocate for priorities and request funding for specific programs. In the next slide, we'll watch a video on the next section of the budget resolution.
2. Congress writes and votes on a budget resolution. Congress is made of two parts, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Sometimes we will call the House of Representatives just the House. After Congress gets the president's budget request, the House and the Senate write and vote on their own separate budget resolutions. A budget resolution is the House and Senate's own plan for how the government will spend money. Sometimes the president and Congress disagree on what is important. That means that the budget resolutions from Congress can end up looking very different from the president's budget request. While the president's budget is an important starting point, it is up to the House and Senate to make final decisions about what important things will be included in the federal budget. If the House and the Senate disagree on what is important, they will write different budget resolutions. If the House and the Senate write different budget resolutions, they have three choices. The Senate can get rid of their own bill and pass the House's version. The House can get rid of their own bill and pass the Senate's version. Or they can compromise. When the House and the Senate compromise on a bill, it is called going to conference. The people who meet are called the conference committee. The conference committee looks at the two different budget resolutions from the House and the Senate. Then, the conference committee turns them both into one final budget resolution for the House and Senate to vote on. If the Senate and House both vote for the budget resolution, then that budget resolution passes. But the budget resolution is just a plan. Passing the budget resolution doesn't mean anything happens. It's up to the appropriations bills to explain how to actually spend money in the budget.
So as mentioned in the video, the budget resolution is a framework that sets the overall spending limit based on how much money the federal government must raise via taxes or revenues, as well as the deficits or debts that it takes on. The resolution often creates a budget total, sometimes called a top line number, that Congress must not go above without raising additional revenue. The budget resolution serves as a blueprint on how much funding is available and sets instructions for the appropriation process, which we will hear a little bit more about in future slides. The budget resolution is created after the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, publishes an analysis of the president's proposal. The Congressional Budget Office conducts independent, nonpartisan analysis of the budget and economic issues, as well as cost estimates for proposed legislation to support the congressional budget process. For example, the Congressional Budget Office can provide a cost analysis of how much it would cost for there to be more funding allocated to the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, or USCIS, to process more applications. Then the budget committees in both the House and the Senate consider the president's budget proposal and the budget report to their respective budget resolutions. Each committee submits a budget resolution to the House and the Senate by April 1st. Now, the House and the Senate then considers these budget resolutions. There is no requirement for either the House or the Senate to pass a budget resolution. There may not be a budget resolution every year. If there is not one established, the previous year's resolution remains in force. However, to increase discretionary funding, Congress requires the authority through a budget resolution. Because many of the programs that we advocate for need additional funding, it is important that we advocate with those on the budget committees in the House and the Senate for the highest possible top line number in the budget resolution. As mentioned in the last slide, in order to increase discretionary funding, Congress requires the authority through the budget resolution. So if we want our programs to receive more funds, then that top line number needs to increase. If not, it would mean that we're advocating for more money for one program, and it may take away money from another program to fund those changes. This advocacy should begin before the president submits his budget to Congress. And it is very important to align these advocacy conversations with the Office of Management and Budget, as well as the White House. These advocacy efforts can be done in partnership with coalitions, and it can look in a variety of different ways, such as conversations, letters, sign-on letters, and outreach to agencies and congressional staff. In the next slide, we'll dive deeper into the next part of the budget process, how the House and the Senate write their appropriations bills.
3. The House and the Senate write appropriations bills. The House and the Senate both have a lot of small groups called committees. Committees pay special attention to different topics, like education or the Army. The committee that pays attention to how to spend the money in the budget is called the Appropriations Committee. The House and the Senate both have their own appropriations committees. The Appropriations Committee is made of even smaller groups called subcommittees. Right now, there are 12 subcommittees. Subcommittees focus on different things that the federal government does. Each subcommittee has a meeting where they talk to different people in charge of different parts of the federal government. Then each subcommittee writes a bill to tell the Appropriations Committee what they decided. The Appropriations Committee marks up the bills based on what the subcommittees decide. Markup means that the committee can make changes to the bills. If someone on the committee wants to make a change, the change is called an amendment. Once the Appropriations Committee is done making changes, they vote on the bill. If the bill gets enough votes, the appropriations bill goes on to the next step. The Appropriations Committee must do this whole process 12 times, once for each of the 12 different subcommittees. The House and the Senate both have their own separate appropriations committees. They both use the same process for writing appropriations bills, but they might not do it at the same time. Usually, the House goes first.
So as we learned, to help organize the many programs, policies, and agencies Congress covers, the House and Senate divide work across groups called committees. These committees are then split into smaller groups called subcommittees that focus on more detailed topics. One of the many committees in the House and the Senate is the Appropriations Committee, which is responsible for writing appropriations bills. The Appropriations Committee is made up of 12 subcommittees that are responsible for writing the 12 required appropriations bills. So there are appropriations committees and subcommittees in the House and appropriations committee and subcommittees in the Senate. The first draft of the 12 appropriations bills are written at the committee level. After that, the committee gathers information to support those subcommittees writing the bills. They gather information in the following ways: by meeting with federal agencies under their jurisdiction or authority, Each subcommittee is responsible for a specific set of agencies and programs. Asking for input from non-appropriations committee members in Congress and holding public hearings. Each subcommittee sets its own deadlines to gather that information. And the process to write these bills usually begins shortly after the president's budget request to Congress, and the process to write the bills moves separately in each chamber. Each subcommittee takes the information they collect and writes a bill that is reviewed and edited or marked up within the subcommittee. When the bill gets enough votes in the subcommittee level, it is then sent to the full appropriations committee for a round of edits or markups and goes through a voting process. Once approved and passed by the full appropriations committee, the bill moves to a full floor vote, or a vote that all members in the House and all members in the Senate participate in. This happens after a round of markups and amendments or changes. The House and Senate must pass bills from subcommittee to full committee and then finally to a full floor vote in each chamber before an agreement can be reached between the House and the Senate. So there are several ways you can act to influence what's included in appropriations bills. This can be to influence more funding for programs and agencies that are seen as helpful and necessary, or even less funding for programs and agencies that are seen as harmful and unnecessary. Some of the ways to influence this process include reaching out to appropriations committee members for meetings. In those meetings or separately, you can send data, research, and messaging materials to support your advocacy asks. It is important to also reach out beyond appropriations committee members. As Alejandra spoke about earlier, that includes budget committee members as well, or individuals who are outside either one of those committees, but maybe on another committee that falls under the jurisdiction or authority of a subcommittee. For example, on the appropriations subcommittees, one of the appropriations subcommittees is the Labor, Health, and Human Services Subcommittee. Outside of that particular subcommittee across Congress, there are other committees that work on education, labor, and health issues that are not connected to the appropriations process, but still can have influence with appropriations committee members. It is especially important to reach directly out to your member of Congress. Congressional constituents have a lot of sway and weight with their members of Congress to influence what they are advocating for in terms of the federal budget. And they can also pass that commitment and advocacy on to members of the Appropriations Committee and subcommittees. You can also submit written testimony during hearings, or write, circulate, and submit sign-on letters within your organization. Or you can work in coalition by connecting with other organizations to create and/or support sign-on letters, developing messaging, and collaborating on advocacy strategies. We're almost at the halfway point, so I'm going to turn it over to Sonia.
Thank you. So we are just about at the halfway point. We're working through this budget process and training, and we want to give everyone the opportunity to take a break or join an optional question and answer session with Alicia and Alejandra. For those who have questions now, you can stay in the main room for questions in English, or join the breakout room if you prefer to speak in Spanish. After 10 minutes, we will reconvene in the main room to hear some of the questions that you have up to this point, and then we'll continue with our presentation. There will also be another opportunity at the end of the presentation for more questions. For those who want to take the 10-minute break, we will reconvene around 12:50. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you back at 12:50.
Great. So one thing that came up in the Spanish group is just want to clarify that this is the federal process that we're talking about, and the state funding process looks very different. but it is important to advocate for the federal funding for our programs. But then there's a second step that some of you who are state advocates also know about, that you need to advocate for your states to distribute those funds in a way that helps the community, it is equitable. And so I just want to make sure that you all understand that this is the federal process, but there are more processes that go in place before the fundings actually get to the programs that we all care about. And then another thing that we touched on is that this training is for you all to become leaders and to be able to share this information with other parents in your networks. This will not be a one and done. We will continue to support you as you grow in your knowledge. And so we want to stress that this is a very complicated process. We will share as much information as we can. We're happy to answer questions in the future. I know that some of us need time to process the information. So we really want to stress that this is not the only time you'll see us. And we hope that you really learned something from today and are able to share that with other parents so that we can continue to advocate for our programs. And I will pass it back to Alicia to get us started or share any other questions that might have been asked in the English group that would be helpful for the Spanish speaking group as well.
Yes, thank you for redirecting me, Alejandra. I completely forgot to do that, to share out the question. And so in our breakout room, we did talk a bit about how the federal process does impact the state process. In order for states to get funding, increase their funding and get additional funds to be able to do work inside of their state, there has to be increases from the federal budget as well to pass to states. So we did talk a bit about that. We also talked about the difference between how UPLAN advocates related to passing legislation and bills and how that's connected to the appropriations process. Speaking directly to UPLAN came up with a great idea. They have a bill, they have support in Congress. Congress is ready to pass a bill, and that bill was connected to an authorizing bill that authorizes that program to exist. However, in order for that program to actually receive funding, it has to go through the appropriations process, which we're here talking about today. And so we also talked about the difference that there are some bills that are connected to mandatory funding where they do not have to go to the appropriations process. And we used Build Back Better as an example. That would have included mandatory money and would have been an entitlement program so that everyone was entitled to funds and Congress did not have to continue to go back and pass funding each year for that program. So those are the couple of questions that we got in this room, and I know we'll have more time for questions at the end. So now I am really going to get the—
Elisa, hang on.
Just before.
Yeah.
We'd like to take a picture really fast. Everybody could turn on their cameras.
If you feel comfortable turning on your camera, we are so thrilled with the participation, and we want to share on our social media. And so if everybody who's ready to take a picture, I'm going to count to 3 because we don't all fit in one screen. I'm going to take several pictures. So when I count to 3, 1, 2, 3, cheese. Let me do one more. 1, 2, 3, cheese. Thank you.
Thank you for doing that. Okay, Alicia.
Yes, okay, you would think that with all that time, I would have gotten this together, but of course not. I was too worried about the picture. So let me share the screen and then. All right, I think we're back in action.
4. The Senate and
So before I go dive right into that video, we're going to start at step 4, which picks up from the Senate and the House writing their appropriations bills to the process of how they combine those bills into one final set of bills, 12 appropriations bills.
4. The Senate and House vote on all of the different appropriations bills. Once the House Appropriations Bills Committee has voted for a bill, the whole House gets a chance to vote on the bill. If the bill gets enough votes in the House, then it goes to the Senate. Sometimes the Senate writes their own bills while the House is still writing the House bill. Usually, the Senate waits for the House to finish their appropriations bills first. When the House appropriations bills are ready, the appropriations subcommittees in the Senate look at the House appropriations bills. The Senate appropriations subcommittees decide if they want to make any changes. Then, they give the new version of the bills to the Senate Appropriations Committee. The bills get marked up again, which means that the Senate Appropriations Committee can make more changes. The Senate Appropriations Committee votes on the bills. And finally, the whole Senate gets a chance to vote for the bills. In order for a bill to pass, the Senate and the House both have to vote on the same version. If one side makes changes to the bill, the other side has to vote for the bill again. It can take a very long time to have both the House and Senate agree on all the bills. It is normal if this sounds confusing and complicated. It is confusing and complicated even for people who have been in Congress for a long time.
So, no matter which chamber passes their bill first, or who starts the process to draft bills, or if the Senate takes a version from the House and makes changes, the House and Senate must vote on the same version of all 12 appropriations bills. Usually, the House will complete their process first and send their final version of the bills to the Senate for review, markup, amendments, and voting. When a bill is sent to the other chamber for review and markup, this process begins the appropriations process at the subcommittee level. Then it moves to the full appropriations committee level, and then finally the full House or Senate for a vote. So the bill goes from one chamber to the other, where it starts at the subcommittee level and works its way up to a full floor vote. Negotiations between the House and the Senate, as well as markups and votes to accept or reject changes, is a process that continues until a final version is created that both chambers can agree and vote on. The House and Senate must combine and pass their bills before the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th, or pass a bill that allows for more time called a continuing resolution. Like all other bills passed in Congress, the House and Senate must vote on and pass identical continuing resolution bills, and the President must sign it to give Congress more time to resolve the differences with the different version of the 12 appropriations bills. If Congress cannot agree on a continuing resolution, also known as a CR, this could lead to a government shutdown since discretionary funding is not available and mandatory funding has restricted. When a continuing resolution is passed, giving Congress more time to get to an agreement on a final bill, discretionary or annual funding remains at the same level as the previous year. Continuing resolutions have an expiration date. Final appropriations bills are not passed before that continuing resolution bill expires. Congress must keep passing continuing resolutions until all 12 bills are passed or risk a government shutdown. As the House and Senate work to combine their bills and come to an agreement on a final funding level, there are a few ways that you can influence the process. You can continue reaching out through meetings, letters, and sending materials to Congress for those who are on appropriations committees. You can influence members on appropriation subcommittees, and you can also reach out to those in leadership positions such as Speaker of the House, Senate Majority Leader, Minority Leader. It is important that in the House, most often that advocacy will focus on people who are in those specific districts and who are their congressional members, whereas in the Senate, it can be broader and you can reach out to people who are representing your specific state. And you can do this advocacy and continue to reach out to members of Congress connected to these committees by continuing to connect the impact and need of funding through messaging to elevate the importance of those funding increases. So being very specific about what these funding increases mean and how they will impact change.
Now, the final process is once both the House and the Senate pass the same bill, it is sent to the president to be signed into law. And this means that the new budget is now law. So what we talked about today is what the budget process should ideally look like. For example, the president's budget is submitted to Congress the first week of February, and the budget is passed before the September 30th deadline. However, the budget process is not always a neat process and can be slowed down by a late presidential budget, elections, a divided Congress, congressional members holding up the process or stopping for other priorities, political disagreements, or a national or international emergency such as weather, war, or health crisis. For the last fiscal year 2022, the president did not submit their budget until May of 2021, well after the February deadline, and the budget was not passed until March 2022, well after the September 30th deadline. Similarly, we are now in March and the president just unveiled his budget today. So this is well after the expected deadline, but we are excited to start the next step of the advocacy effort in this fiscal year. Now that we went through an overview of the budget process, I want to pass it off to Sonia so we can hear about some of the work UPLAN has done to influence the budget process in the past and how we can continue to work together to advocate during the current budget process.
Thank you. So parent ambassadors are very active in reaching out to our national representatives. We have done a lot of things like phone to action, where we've sent out action alerts, and it's a pre-written letter through UPLAN, and it has gone out to all of our organizations, and it's really easy to just click on it, put in your information, and it goes out to all of the members that we need to send it to. We've also done meetings with our different representatives and different people that hold public office while we are in DC. One of the things that has been really exciting for us to do is we have met with a lot of members from like the Office of Head Start to talk about things that are important in the budget, so that when the budget does come out, we're hoping that they can make sure and support that. We've also met with people on our Appropriations Committee and talked about things that are important to UPLAN and our states. And with that, Crystal, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about some of the stuff that you have done with UPLAN and also in California.
Yeah, I apologize for the unflattering angle. I've got a toddler asleep on me right now. My name is Crystal England, and I am part of Parent Voices California, as well as UPLAN, as well as the Child Care for Every Family Network. And for my piece, I really just feel like the important thing is, as parents, is not to forget the power of your story and pre-planning. My story comes sort of from last year when we were all working towards Build Back Better and not really understanding this budget process. And now I'm thinking maybe we got stuck in like number 3, where it was in the Senate, but like it wasn't going anywhere. They were doing the markups. But I remember we were working with our parent and family leadership group, and a lot of the parents were really interested in doing sort of videos that they could send to their legislators or to get more parents on the ground rallied around. But we were confused. Who's our target? Are we targeting other parents to get momentum? Are we targeting Mansion or Cinema or our own legislators? And ultimately, we didn't end up doing the videos and we didn't end up getting the momentum that we wanted because we learned that, as Alejandra had mentioned, things don't always go in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, and smoothly. It honestly felt like we were stuck in a telenovela where, friends of friends and our advocates on the ground were telling us about what was happening in Congress, and we kept pivoting and trying to meet the policy or the opportunity window that we were in. And we sort of forfeited our own power where we could insert ourselves into these spaces. So I guess for me, it's just always prepare in advance. I think that having, if parents want to do videos or whatever other type of outreach, I think it's important to have those prepared so that you can pivot when things move from one house to another or from one committee to another. So that way you're already sort of ready for those spaces. And use this budget info to inform like where you put your advocacy efforts, but not how. As parents, our stories are the most powerful things that we have to bring to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Christelle, for sharing that. Mercedes?
Thank you all for sharing the wonderful work that UPLAN has done. And now we can move on to some questions. We want to open it up to all of you to see if you have any questions. Since this is sort of a larger group, we would love if you can use your raised hand function, or feel free to add questions in the chat as well. All right, I see some questions are coming up. Maria?
Sí, buenas tardes. Mire, yo estoy envuelta en las escuelas por años. Tengo 3 hijos. Soy madre líder también de la comunidad. Trabajo como promotora también para Community de la Universidad de San José. Mi experiencia como madre y como latina inmigrante, que se nos cierran muchas puertas porque no tenemos el soporte para seguir estudiando. ¿Por qué? Porque no tenemos un documento. Yo hoy, gracias a Dios, cuento con un permiso de trabajo, pero nuestros hermanos, nuestra comunidad latina, aún necesita un soporte con una reforma migratoria. No los dejemos en el olvido. Nuestros niños están llegando siempre, día a día llegan y no saben el idioma. Es una barrera cuando entran a la escuela porque los maestros están batallando. Nuestros maestros necesitan el soporte, necesitan otro maestro que les ayude. Es lo que yo ayer comentaba en otra reunión de la escuela. Si solamente nos enfocamos en mandar a nuestros niños, si no nos involucramos tampoco como padres, esto no estamos haciendo nuestro trabajo, porque el 75% es la responsabilidad como padres, pero también nosotros necesitamos un soporte de parte del gobierno. Queremos seguir estudiando, preparándonos por los sueños para poder lograr graduarnos como nuestros hijos, ¿verdad? Con honores y ser la voz latina. Y yo estoy lista, como les puse en el chat, estoy lista, porque sé lo que es atravesar en no saber el idioma, en las barreras que batallamos, ¿verdad? Como padres, y tenemos miedo a involucrarnos porque decimos, no sé el inglés, y eso es mentira. Sí podemos hacerlo en nuestro idioma. Yo llevo 6 meses estudiando gracias a una escuela que me dio la oportunidad por vía Zoom, pero necesitamos más padres involucrados y también en el idioma.
Thank you, Maria.
Sí, ya.
Yes. Can everyone please select your language? At the bottom, there should be a little globe where you can select English or Spanish. If you don't see it, there should be 3 dots. And thank you, Maria. We do understand that immigration reform is a really important topic. We know that UPLAN's immigration committee is, advocating for immigrant families, as well as CLASP immigration team. So we definitely appreciate that. Other Maria?
Okay, yeah, I've unmuted myself now. So when we, we do our city campaign and we do our state campaign and we know exactly who to target, it's a little bit difficult when it's federal because the target legislator may not be from our state. So how do we make sure that parents from San Francisco can influence cinema or can influence Mansion, who is not from our district, who are not from our district?
That is a great question. I think Alicia wants to answer, so I can let her answer.
Yes, I'm struggling. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. The last slide is just saying thank you, so I can see everyone. I'm not doing well on the slide sharing, so I'm going to stop that and answer your question. That's such a great question because the people who maybe your member of Congress are not necessarily represented in the Appropriations Committee. But the way that you work around that is to reach out to your member of Congress and ask them, who are you reaching out to? What are you looking for from the appropriations process this year? What are you thinking about this particular policy, this particular program? Because although there are specific members on the Appropriations Committee, everyone in Congress theoretically works together and works with each other to pass legislation, to be able to do the markups, to do this process, and everybody gets a chance to vote at some point in the process. So everybody does have some power in the appropriations process on the Hill. So it's important to reach out to your member of Congress when possible, working in coalition. So maybe you're in a state that is not connected to that particular member of Congress, but maybe someone else is another state and you meet collectively to say, we're representing from these states and we would love to talk to you about this. Just have one person on there that is from that state. And there you go. There's your key way to be able to reach out to that particular member of Congress.
And I think UPLAN is such a great coalition because you have so many partners from so many states that are represented. And so use the power of UPLAN to your advantage to get your voices heard. I see that Mr. Albert has their hand up.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going back what Maria said, and I just want to clarify that I know some states are different, but I know that it's a law, it's a mandatory. Whoever needs to translate, they need to help them. Whoever needs to educate and go to a school, they need to educate, because here in Bridgeport, Connecticut, we got that law and we never say no. Doesn't matter, it can be Spanish, English, Chinese, Haiti, Russia, whatever. We have a bilingual department, and trust me, as Latino, I will never accept that, because I'm the president of the Latino community here in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I want to be sure that all my parents is Spanish, not only Spanish, any language, they can translate and they can have whatever they need, education, help, housing, whatever. So it's very important. I don't know if you want somebody to translate this to Maria. I already put in my chat, my email and my phone number. I don't care what country you are. Trust me that I will help you. I get involved a lot with a policy, with the governor, with everything. I don't want to keep speaking because then nobody can speak. I just want to say that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. And I will share that I think Muna's on the call, said this very eloquently in a conversation we had last week, that a lot of times the laws, especially relating to language access, don't translate to the experiences of parents. So we completely understand and love that you're able to support families, and that's a really important thing. Thank you.
Just for finish very fast, just because we are Latino, we cannot give up and don't be scared. We had the vote and we had the voice. I'm going to translate very fast in Spanish. Yo porque somos latinos no significa que no tenemos voz y no tenemos voto. Sí lo tenemos, porque la mayoría en este Estados Unidos somos hispanos. Almost the majority in the United States, they're Hispanic. I just want to say that to close. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know we have some questions in the chat. Alicia, I'm going to read them to you if you want to answer. So the first one is, can we have additional trainings in this area? I don't think I will be able to be familiar with the budget process until I get 1 or 2 more trainings.
Yes, that is a great question. And this is kind of jumping ahead, but I know there is going to be a follow-up survey that's going to be sent out to people who attended the training to give that kind of feedback and those kind of thoughts about where you would like to get more information. You have our slides and you can say this part, you know, I would love to learn more about that. So I think that is, the answer is short answer is yes, there will be more trainings and more opportunities, and it'll be great in that follow-up survey that I think Jacqueline or Mercedes will probably talk about more specifically. But that's the answer.
Thank you. And then another question, how can we advocate for educational equity when children of color with invisible and visible disabilities are constantly getting segregated from their non-disabled peers? And when a parent advocates at a school to do the right thing, the schools bring in attorneys to oppress the parents. Parents cannot afford to hire attorneys because many attorneys prefer to work for school districts.
That's also a great question. And I think that some of the pieces that you all are, first and foremost, making things better is expensive. It costs money and there needs to be more funding. I think that's full stop. Within how that those funding increases happen, there's certainly opportunity to make things more equitable. I don't think it's a one thing first and another thing. They can happen at the same time to make sure that as funding is going up, we are working towards policy that's more equitable, inclusive, that's thinking about people's different needs and backgrounds, where you come from. It's important to do those two pieces together. There's also some things that are controlled by the federal government that, and there are more states' rights in education. K-12 education falls more so under the state level. And so, yes, while there's an opportunity for more funding at the federal level, the actual what happens at the state level in schools is outside of this presentation, but it would be great to do some more presentations on what the federal budget looks like in terms of the federal level and what is more controlled at the state level, because I think that's also an important conversation. I know we're getting close to the end, and we know we have some like closing pieces to do. I see one more hand up as well.
And there's one more in the chat that's sort of related, which is talking about when federal money comes into the state general fund, do both government entities, federal and state elected officials, then consider these dollars to be state funding and fall under state appropriations laws? And how can we advocate for federal laws, or for the federal level to not dismiss the state laws?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm so excited to answer questions. I love it. I love it. So I would say that, yes, once the federal government passes the appropriations laws and the funding is transferred to the specific agency, then it's up to that agency, based on what was included in the bill, how to spread that funding out across states and what that looks like. And so that once the money is passed to states, states do have to act within the requirements of that particular bill, but states are free to spend that money and make those decisions within state legislators. And each state's legislator, so the House and Senate within the state, they also have their own rules, different rules across states. I think this also sounds like another opportunity to talk more about it. I work a lot at the federal level, and we have I have a colleague that works very closely with state legislators and does a lot of that work too. And she can speak to a lot of those pieces of what happens after the federal budget passes and funding goes to state and what advocacy looks like there. Because I think it is important that this is one piece of how everything eventually does go to impact parents, and parents have to be involved in each of those steps in order to make it clear that the federal government is connected to state governments and state governments are connected to parents and families. And I think that's incredibly important. And then I think we can get to that, to the raised hand question.
Yes, Marlene.
Sí, yo tengo una pregunta, si hay aquí alguna organización que apoya, aquí donde yo vivo el problema ahorita se está viendo en las armas, la facilidad de las armas para los jóvenes. Mi hijo fue víctima de una bala en la escuela por una negligencia. Otra de las cosas, no se les dan las adaptaciones a los niños con educación especial. En mayoría somos mamás de habla hispana Entonces, ahora que veo tanto apoyo en ustedes, me gustaría saber si hay alguna organización que nos pueda apoyar o la manera de ver cómo hacemos llegar esto como una propuesta de cambio de ley para el uso de las armas, para respetar las adaptaciones de los niños con condición especial, entre muchas otras, pero lo más importante, necesitamos una organización que nos apoye como padres víctimas de todo lo que está pasando.
Thank you for that question. Alicia and I work mainly on childcare, but we are happy to see if we can find some organizations that work on gun safety and share those with you. Well, we are getting to the end of our presentation. We want to thank all of you for being here with us today. We want to thank UPLAN for their partnership in this work and for you taking time out of your days to be here with us.